The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Sarah Martinez adjusted her camera strap and checked her phone for the 100th time. She had been planning this London vacation for 2 years, saving every penny from her job at a small marketing firm in Phoenix. The Royal Guard ceremony was at the top of her must-see list, right after the Tower of London and Big Ben. Standing beside her, her boyfriend Jake Thompson bounced on his heels with barely contained excitement. Jake was the type of person who turned every vacation into an adventure, often pushing boundaries that made Sarah nervous. His Instagram account was filled with photos of himself posing with street performers, climbing onto statues, and getting uncomfortably close to wildlife during their previous trips. "This is going to be epic," Jake whispered, pulling out his phone to start recording. "I read online that these guards aren't allowed to move or speak no matter what happens. We could literally do anything and they'd just stand there like statues." Sarah frowned, adjusting her sun hat. "Jake, I don't think that's entirely true. And even if it is, these are real soldiers doing their job. We should be respectful." But Jake wasn't listening. He was already scanning the area, his eyes lighting up as he spotted the iconic red-coated guards standing at attention outside the palace gates. Their tall black bearskin hats made them look even more imposing, and their rifles were held perfectly straight against their shoulders. Tourists were already gathering, creating a small crowd of international visitors all eager to witness the famous changing of the guard. A family from Germany stood nearby, their children pointing excitedly at the guards while their parents tried to get the perfect family photo. An elderly couple from Japan sat on a nearby bench, the woman carefully arranging flowers she had brought to photograph alongside the guards. Everyone seemed content to admire from a respectful distance, taking photos and marveling at the precision and discipline of the ceremonial guards. Jake, however, had different plans brewing in his mind. He had seen videos on social media of tourists trying to make the guards laugh or react, and while most failed, the few who succeeded became internet sensations overnight. The idea of going viral was too tempting for someone like Jake, who measured his self-worth by likes and shares. "Watch this," he said to Sarah, but she was distracted by a beautiful flower garden nearby and didn't hear him. Jake started walking toward the nearest guard, a tall man who looked to be in his 30s, standing perfectly still with his eyes focused straight ahead. The guard's red tunic was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his white gloves gripped his rifle with unwavering steadiness. Other tourists began to notice Jake's approach, some pulling out their own phones in anticipation of whatever was about to happen. A few whispered warnings to their companions, sensing that this American tourist was about to cross a line that shouldn't be crossed. The guard Jake was approaching had been standing at his post for 45 minutes without so much as a twitch. His name was Corporal William Davies, a veteran of 2 tours in Afghanistan who had earned his position through years of dedicated service. He took enormous pride in his role as a Queen's Guard, understanding that he represented not just himself, but the entire British military and the monarchy itself. As Jake got closer, Corporal Davies could see the young man in his peripheral vision, though his eyes never moved from their fixed position. He had dealt with countless tourists over his 3 years of ceremonial duty, and he could already sense that this one was going to be different from the respectful visitors who typically admired from afar. Jake stopped just 2 feet away from the guard, close enough that he could see the individual threads in the red wool of his tunic. He raised his phone and started recording, speaking in a loud voice clearly intended to provoke a reaction. "Hey there, soldier boy. Can you hear me? I bet you can't even blink, can you?" Jake circled around the guard slowly, his phone capturing every angle. "My girlfriend thinks you guys are so disciplined and professional, but I think you're just playing dress-up. What do you think about that?" The surrounding tourists began to shift uncomfortably, some shaking their heads at Jake's behavior. Sarah finally noticed what was happening and started walking quickly toward her boyfriend, her face flushing with embarrassment. She could see the disapproving looks from other visitors, and she knew Jake was about to make a scene that would ruin their entire trip. Corporal Davies remained motionless, but inside his mind, he was calculating. He knew the rules of engagement for dealing with disruptive tourists, and he was rapidly approaching the point where action would be necessary. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, though he always hoped it wouldn't come to that. The tension in the air was palpable as more tourists stopped to watch what was unfolding. Some began recording their own videos, sensing that they were about to witness something that would end up on the evening news. The security cameras positioned around the palace grounds were capturing every moment, and the palace security team was already being alerted to the developing situation. Jake, oblivious to the storm he was about to unleash, took another step closer to the guard, his confidence growing with each passing second that nothing happened. He was about to learn a very important lesson about the difference between internet videos and real life, and why the Queen's Guard had maintained their legendary reputation for over 350 years. Jake's confidence was building by the second as he continued his one-sided conversation with Corporal Davies. The guard hadn't moved a muscle, which Jake interpreted as proof that he could do whatever he wanted without consequences. He stepped even closer, now barely 18 inches from the motionless soldier. "Come on, man, not even a smile. I flew all the way from Arizona to see you guys, and this is the welcome I get?" Jake waved his hand in front of the guard's face, trying to break his concentration. "I bet if I stood here long enough, you'd eventually crack. Everyone has their breaking point." Sarah finally reached the scene, her cheeks burning with shame as she saw the crowd of tourists that had gathered to watch her boyfriend's spectacle. She grabbed Jake's arm and tried to pull him away, but he shrugged her off, too caught up in his performance to listen to reason. "Jake, please stop this right now," she whispered urgently. "You're embarrassing us both, and you're being incredibly disrespectful. These are real soldiers, not theme park actors." But Jake was riding high on the attention he was receiving. His phone showed that his live stream already had over 200 viewers, with comments flooding in from friends back home. Most were laughing and encouraging him to keep going, though a few were expressing concern about what he was doing. "Don't worry, babe," Jake said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "These guys are basically human statues. Watch this." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a banana he had bought for breakfast. "I'm going to see if I can balance this on his hat without him moving." The crowd's murmur grew louder, with several people calling out for Jake to stop. An elderly British gentleman in a tweed jacket stepped forward, his face red with indignation. "Young man, you need to step away from the guard immediately," the gentleman said in a crisp accent. "What you're doing is not only disrespectful but potentially dangerous. These are active military personnel performing an important duty." Jake turned to face the older man, his American accent thick with sarcasm. "Oh, come on, Grandpa. Lighten up. I'm just having some fun. No one's getting hurt here. Besides, isn't this what tourists are supposed to do? Take funny pictures and make memories?" The British gentleman's jaw tightened. "That guard is Corporal Davies of the Grenadier Guards. He served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan defending your freedom as much as ours. The least you can do is show him the respect he deserves." Jake rolled his eyes and turned back to the guard, raising the banana toward his bearskin hat. "Whatever, old man. Mind your own business." He stretched upward, trying to reach the top of the tall ceremonial hat, when suddenly something changed in the air around him. Corporal Davies had been monitoring the situation carefully, and Jake's attempt to place an object on his ceremonial uniform crossed the line from disrespectful behavior into actual interference with military duties. The moment Jake's hand came within 12 inches of his hat, the guard's training kicked into full gear. With lightning-fast precision that caught everyone by surprise, Corporal Davies executed a perfect ceremonial movement, bringing his rifle down in a sharp arc while simultaneously taking a commanding step forward. The butt of his rifle struck the ground with a resounding crack that echoed across the courtyard, causing Jake to jump backward and drop his banana. "Make way for the Queen's Guard," Corporal Davies bellowed in a voice that carried the full authority of the British Army. His shout was so powerful and unexpected that several tourists screamed in surprise, and Jake stumbled backward into Sarah, nearly knocking her over. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. One moment there had been a silent, motionless figure in a ceremonial uniform, and the next there was a battle-hardened soldier asserting his authority with the kind of commanding presence that had made the British military legendary around the world. Jake's face had gone completely white, and his hands were shaking as he tried to hold onto his phone, which had nearly fallen during his panicked retreat. The banana lay forgotten on the cobblestones, looking somehow ridiculous and pathetic in the aftermath of the guard's explosive response. I wasn't," Jake stammered, but his voice came out as barely a whisper compared to the booming authority he had just witnessed. Corporal Davies had returned to his position of attention, but the atmosphere around him had completely changed. Every tourist in the vicinity now understood that they were not looking at a costumed performer or a living statue, but at a professional soldier who would not tolerate any interference with his duties. The crowd that had gathered to watch Jake's antics was now backing away, many of them looking ashamed that they had been entertained by the disrespectful behavior. Parents pulled their children closer, using the moment as a teaching opportunity about respect and proper behavior. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm again, this time successfully pulling him away from the guard. Her face was a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and relief that nothing worse had happened. She had been imagining headlines about her boyfriend being arrested at Buckingham Palace, and she was grateful that the guard's response had been measured and professional. "We're leaving right now," she hissed into Jake's ear, but as they started to walk away, she noticed that other guards in the area had been alerted to the disturbance. 2 additional Queen's guards were moving into position, their eyes scanning the crowd for any signs of further disruption. Jake's viral moment had taken a turn he hadn't expected, and the day that was supposed to launch his social media fame was quickly becoming the most humiliating experience of his life. But the encounter with Corporal Davies was only the beginning of what would become a very educational day for the young American tourist. Sarah managed to drag Jake about 50 yards away from Corporal Davies before he finally stopped resisting her pull. His face was still pale, and she could see his hands trembling as he tried to process what had just happened. The confident, cocky attitude he had displayed just minutes earlier had evaporated completely. "Did you see that?" Jake whispered, his voice shaky. "He moved so fast I didn't even see it coming." And that voice? Man, he sounded like he could lead an army into battle. "That's because he probably has," Sarah snapped, her own adrenaline still pumping. "Jake, what were you thinking? I told you these weren't actors or performers. They're real soldiers with real authority, and you just learned that lesson the hard way." Jake looked back toward Corporal Davies, who had returned to his perfectly still position as if nothing had happened. Other tourists were giving the guard much more space now, and Jake could see the respect and slight fear in their eyes as they took their photos from a respectful distance. "I need to sit down," Jake muttered, spotting a bench across the courtyard. As they walked toward it, he noticed that people were staring at him. Some looked amused, others disapproving, but most seemed to be shaking their heads at the foolish American who had thought he could mess with the Queen's Guard. They had barely settled on the bench when Jake's phone started buzzing with notifications. His live stream had been running the entire time, and the video of his encounter with Corporal Davies was already being shared across social media platforms. But as he read the comments, his heart sank further. Instead of the supportive laughter he had expected from his friends, most of the comments were critical. People were calling him disrespectful, ignorant, and embarrassing. Several British users had shared historical information about the Queen's Guard, explaining their military background and the significance of their role. "Oh no," Jake groaned, scrolling through the rapidly multiplying comments. "This is not going viral the way I wanted it to. People are roasting me alive in here." Sarah peered over his shoulder and saw comments like, "Typical American tourist. Show some respect," and "That guard showed incredible restraint." One comment that particularly stung read, "Imagine flying thousands of miles just to act like a complete fool in front of the world." But Jake's troubles were far from over. As they sat on the bench trying to figure out their next move, a police officer approached them. Constable Emma Thompson of the Metropolitan Police had been monitoring the situation and had received reports about the disturbance from palace security. "Excuse me," Constable Thompson said in a professional but firm tone. "Are you the gentleman who was just interacting with one of the Queen's Guards?" Jake's stomach dropped. Yes, that was me. But I didn't do anything illegal, did I? I mean, I didn't touch him or anything." "You came very close to interfering with a military sentry performing official duties," the constable explained. "While the guard showed admirable restraint, your behavior was inappropriate and could have resulted in more serious consequences." Sarah felt her cheeks burning again as other tourists stopped to listen to the conversation. She had never been more embarrassed in her life, and she was starting to wonder if their relationship could survive this trip. "I want you to understand something," Constable Thompson continued, her voice carrying the same authority that Corporal Davies had displayed. "The Queen's Guards are not tourist attractions. They are active military personnel responsible for protecting royal residences and state functions. They have the legal authority to detain anyone who interferes with their duties. Jake nodded frantically, eager to show that he understood the gravity of the situation. Yes, ma'am. I get it now. I was just trying to have some fun, but I realized I was being stupid. The guard's response was measured and appropriate, the officer said. But I need to make it clear that if you or anyone else attempts to interfere with the guards again, you could face arrest for obstruction and disrespecting military personnel. Do I make myself clear? Crystal clear, Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the constable walked away, Jake slumped forward on the bench, his head in his hands. The confident social media influencer who had started the day was nowhere to be found, replaced by a humbled and thoroughly embarrassed young man who was beginning to understand the difference between entertainment and real life. I can't believe I thought this was a good idea, he mumbled into his palms. I made myself look like a complete idiot in front of the entire internet. Sarah wanted to comfort him, but she was still processing her own anger and embarrassment. She had tried to warn him, but he had been too caught up in his quest for viral fame to listen to reason. As they sat in uncomfortable silence, neither of them noticed the small crowd of tourists who had followed them at a distance, many still recording with their phones. Jake's humiliation was far from over, and the lessons he was about to learn about respect, consequences, and the power of the internet were just beginning to unfold. The changing of the guard ceremony was scheduled to begin in 30 minutes, and Jake was about to discover that his encounter with Corporal Davies had only been the opening act of a much larger show. 20 minutes after his humiliating encounter with Corporal Davies, Jake was still scrolling through the increasingly harsh comments on his social media when he heard the sound of military drums in the distance. The changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin, and despite everything that had happened, tourists were gathering in larger numbers to witness the spectacle. Maybe we should just go back to the hotel, Jake suggested quietly, but Sarah shook her head. No way, she said firmly. I've been looking forward to seeing this ceremony for years, and I'm not going to let your poor judgment ruin the entire experience. Besides, maybe watching the real ceremony will help you understand what you were interfering with. As they joined the crowd gathering around the palace gates, Jake kept his head down, hoping no one would recognize him as the foolish tourist from earlier. But his hopes were quickly dashed when he heard whispers around him. That's him, a woman with a British accent murmured to her companion. That's the American who tried to mess with the guard. Honestly, her friend replied, some people have no respect at all. Jake's face burned with shame, but Sarah grabbed his arm and pulled him toward a spot where they could see the ceremony. You made this mess, she whispered, so now you're going to stand here and learn something. The transformation that began to unfold before them was unlike anything Jake had ever witnessed. What had seemed like individual guards standing at various posts suddenly became part of a precisely choreographed military operation. The sound of marching feet echoed across the courtyard as the new guard approached in perfect formation. The guards moved with mechanical precision, every step calculated and exact. Their red tunics blazed in the afternoon sun, and their bearskin hats swayed in perfect unison with each measured pace. The military band that accompanied them played traditional marching music that had echoed through these same streets for centuries. Jake found himself mesmerized despite his embarrassment. This wasn't the casual, tourist-friendly performance he had imagined. This was a genuine military ceremony with roots stretching back hundreds of years, executed by soldiers who had earned their positions through rigorous training and dedicated service. Corporal Davies, the guard Jake had tried to humiliate earlier, was part of the ceremony. As he marched with his unit, his face showed no recognition of the incident that had occurred just minutes before. He was focused entirely on his duty, moving with the same precision and discipline that had made the British military legendary around the world. Look at them, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with awe. Every movement is perfect. They've probably practiced this thousands of times. Jake nodded silently, beginning to understand the magnitude of his earlier disrespect. These weren't costumed performers putting on a show for tourists. They were professional soldiers maintaining a tradition that connected modern Britain to its military heritage. As the ceremony continued, Jake noticed something that made his stomach sink even further. Several tourists in the crowd were recording the event, but they were also occasionally pointing their cameras toward him. His infamous encounter with Corporal Davies had made him a reluctant celebrity, and people were documenting his presence at the very ceremony he had tried to disrupt. Jake Thompson, right? A voice beside him asked. He turned to see a middle-aged man with an American accent holding up a phone. I saw your live stream earlier. Pretty crazy stuff, man. Before Jake could respond, the man was already posting to his own social media account. Standing next to the guy who got schooled by the Royal Guard. Still here watching the ceremony, lol. Jake's heart raced as he realized that his humiliation was following him everywhere. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions, and every person with a phone was a potential witness to his ongoing embarrassment. The ceremony reached its climax, as the old guard formally handed over responsibility to the new guard. The precision of the handover was breathtaking, with every salute, every turn, and every spoken command executed flawlessly. The tourists around Jake fell silent, recognizing that they were witnessing something truly special. As the old guard began their march away from the palace, Corporal Davies passed within 10 feet of where Jake was standing. For just a moment their eyes met, and Jake saw something in the soldier's gaze that made him shrink back. It wasn't anger or contempt, but rather a look of profound disappointment that cut deeper than any harsh words could have. In that brief moment, Jake understood that his actions hadn't just been disrespectful to one person, but to an entire institution, a tradition, and a way of life that meant something important to millions of people. The weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. "We need to leave," he whispered to Sarah, but she was still watching the ceremony with rapt attention. "Not yet," she replied. "I want to see the whole thing." But Jake's discomfort was about to get much worse. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, he noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. It was the elderly British gentleman in the tweed jacket who had tried to intervene during his confrontation with Corporal Davies. "Wadimar." Man's expression was stern but not unkind as he stopped, in front of Jake. "I hope you learned something from watching that ceremony, young man," he said quietly. Jake nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The gentleman studied his face for a moment, seeming to weigh his sincerity. "My name is Colonel James Whitfield, retired," the man said. "I served with the Grenadier Guards for 35 years. That young man you tried to humiliate earlier has more courage and discipline in his little finger than most people have in their entire bodies." The colonel's words hit Jake like a sledgehammer, and he felt his eyes beginning to water. The full impact of what he had done was finally sinking in, and the shame was overwhelming. Colonel Whitfield's stern gaze seemed to pierce right through Jake's soul as the retired officer continued speaking. "Corporal Davies enlisted in the Army at 18 years old, straight out of 6th Form College. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan, where he saved 3 of his fellow soldiers' lives during an insurgent attack in Helmand Province." Jake felt his knees go weak as the colonel's words painted a picture of the man he had tried to treat like a theme park attraction. Sarah moved closer to him, her own face pale as she realized the depth of her boyfriend's mistake. "He earned his position with the Queen's Guard through years of exemplary service," the colonel continued, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Every morning, he polishes that uniform with the same dedication he showed when he was dodging bullets in the desert. And you thought it would be amusing to balance fruit on his hat." "Sir, Jake started to speak, but his voice cracked and the words wouldn't come. The shame was so overwhelming that he felt physically sick. "I'm not finished, son," Colonel Whitfield said firmly. "That ceremony you just watched has been performed for over 350 years. It represents the unbroken chain of British military tradition, from the Battle of Waterloo to the beaches of Normandy, to the mountains of Afghanistan. Every guard who stands at those gates is part of that legacy." A small crowd had gathered around them, drawn by the colonel's commanding presence and the obvious drama unfolding. Jake was aware of phones being pointed in his direction again, capturing what was clearly becoming the second act of his public humiliation. "But here's what troubles me most," the colonel said, his tone softening slightly. "You filmed yourself disrespecting that soldier and broadcast it to the world as entertainment. You turned a moment of ignorance into a performance, and in doing so, you didn't just disrespect Corporal Davies. You disrespected every person who has ever worn that uniform." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to the colonel's words. She had been angry at Jake for embarrassing her, but she was beginning to understand that his actions had hurt people in ways she hadn't even considered. "I didn't know," Jake whispered, finally finding his voice. I mean, I knew they were soldiers, but I didn't understand. I thought it was just ceremonial. Like a performance. Ignorance is not an excuse for disrespect, Colonel Whitfield replied, but recognition of your ignorance can be the beginning of wisdom. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Jake looked around at the faces watching him. Some showed anger, others disappointment, but a few seemed curious to see how he would respond to the colonel's challenge. His phone, still clutched in his trembling hand, buzzed with more notifications, but he didn't dare look at them. What should I do? Jake asked, his voice barely audible. That's not for me to decide, the colonel said. But I will tell you this, a real man takes responsibility for his actions. He doesn't hide behind excuses or try to minimize the harm he's caused. He faces it head on and does whatever he can to make it right. As if summoned by the colonel's words, Constable Thompson appeared again, having observed the conversation from a distance. She approached the group with the measured pace of someone who had dealt with countless similar situations. Is everything all right here, Colonel? She asked, clearly recognizing the retired officer. Hello, Emma, the colonel replied. I was just having a conversation with this young gentleman about the importance of respect and responsibility. The constable nodded and turned to Jake. I've been monitoring the situation since our earlier conversation. I'm pleased to see that you're taking the time to understand the significance of what happened. Jake felt like he was shrinking under the weight of so much attention and authority. Every word spoken to him was driving home the magnitude of his mistake, and he was beginning to realize that his problems extended far beyond a single moment of poor judgment. The video of your encounter has been shared thousands of times, Constable Thompson continued. It's been picked up by news outlets, and I'm afraid you've become something of a symbol for disrespectful tourist behavior. Sarah gasped and grabbed Jake's arm. News outlets? What do you mean? The BBC, Sky News, and several American networks have all featured the incident, the constable explained. The headline on most of them is something along the lines of American tourist learns hard lesson from Queen's Guard. Jake's face went completely white as the full scope of his situation became clear. This wasn't just about a few embarrassing social media comments or awkward stares from other tourists. His moment of stupidity was being broadcast around the world, and he was becoming the poster child for everything people disliked about disrespectful tourists. My parents, he whispered, the horror dawning on him. My job, oh God, what if my boss sees this? Those are the consequences of your actions, Colonel Whitfield said, though his tone had become somewhat gentler. But consequences can also be teachers if you're willing to learn from them. The crowd around them had grown larger, with people taking photos and whispering among themselves. Jake realized that there was no escape from the situation he had created for himself. His quest for viral fame had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, but not in the way he had imagined. What happens now? Sarah asked, her voice tight with worry. That depends on your boyfriend, the colonel replied, looking directly at Jake. He can continue to be a cautionary tale about ignorant behavior, or he can become an example of how someone learns from their mistakes and grows as a person. Jake looked up at the colonel, then at Constable Thompson, then at Sarah's worried face. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, he was starting to think about someone other than himself and his own embarrassment. The weight of Colonel Whitfield's words settled on Jake's shoulders like a heavy blanket. Standing there in front of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by strangers who had witnessed his humiliation, he felt smaller than he ever had in his life. But somewhere in that crushing shame, a spark of determination began to flicker. Colonel, Jake said, his voice steadier than it had been all day. Would it be possible for me to apologize to Corporal Davies? I know I can't take back what I did, but I want him to know that I understand how wrong I was. The retired officer studied Jake's face carefully, looking for signs of sincerity. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. That would be a start. But apologizing isn't just about making yourself feel better. It's about acknowledging the harm you've caused and committing to do better. Constable Thompson checked her watch and then spoke quietly into her radio. After a brief exchange, she turned back to the group. The changing of the guard is complete, but I might be able to arrange a brief meeting during the guard's break period. However, this is highly unusual, and it would only happen if I'm convinced you're genuinely remorseful. I am, Jake said immediately. I know that might be hard to believe after what you saw earlier, But meeting the colonel and learning about Corporal Davies's service has changed everything for me. Sarah watched her boyfriend with a mixture of hope and skepticism. She wanted to believe that he was genuinely learning from this experience, but she had seen his impulsive behavior too many times before to trust that this moment of clarity would last. "There's something else you need to understand," Colonel Whitfield said. "Your apology isn't going to magically fix the damage that's been done. That video of you disrespecting the guard is going to follow you for a very long time. The internet never forgets, and neither do the people who care about military tradition." Jake nodded, pulling out his phone to look at the notifications he had been avoiding. His heart sank as he saw that his original live stream had been viewed over 50,000 times in just a few hours. The comments section was a mixture of criticism, mockery, and educational posts about the Queen's Guard. But what really caught his attention was a message from his boss back in Phoenix. "Jake, I just saw the video from London. We need to talk as soon as you get back. This kind of behavior doesn't reflect well on our company." "My job," he whispered, showing the message to Sarah. "I think I might lose my job over this." "Actions have consequences," the colonel said, not unkindly. "But they can also have redemption if you handle them correctly." Constable Thompson returned from her radio conversation with news. "I've spoken with the duty officer, and they're willing to arrange a brief meeting in 15 minutes. But I want to be clear about something. This is an extraordinary courtesy, and it's only happening because Colonel Whitfield vouched for your sincerity." Jake felt a mix of gratitude and terror at the prospect of facing Corporal Davies again. The confident, cocky attitude that had gotten him into this mess was completely gone, replaced by a profound understanding of how badly he had misjudged the situation. As they waited for the arranged meeting, more tourists approached Jake, having recognized him from the viral video. Most were critical, but a few expressed curiosity about what he had learned from the experience. "Are you going to post another video apologizing?" asked a young woman with an Australian accent. Jake hadn't thought about that, but the question made him realize that he had a platform now, whether he wanted it or not. His moment of stupidity had given him an audience, and he had a choice about what to do with that attention. "Maybe," he said thoughtfully, "if it might help other people avoid making the same mistake I did." Sarah looked at him with surprise. This was a side of Jake she rarely saw, reflective and focused on something other than his own image. She began to feel the first glimmer of hope that their relationship might survive this disaster. Colonel Whitfield, who had been observing the interactions quietly, stepped forward. "If you do decide to make another video, remember that an apology is not about you. It's about acknowledging the harm you've caused and your commitment to doing better. It's not an opportunity to rehabilitate your image or gain sympathy." "I understand," Jake said. "I think I'm finally starting to understand a lot of things." As the 15 minutes passed, Jake found himself thinking about Corporal Davies and what the young soldier must be thinking about the whole situation. He wondered if the guard was angry, disappointed, or simply indifferent to the foolish American who had tried to turn his duty into entertainment. When Constable Thompson returned to escort them to the meeting, Jake's heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. This was his chance to make things right, but he also knew it might be his only opportunity to show that he was capable of growth and genuine remorse. The constable led them through a side entrance to a small administrative building adjacent to the palace grounds. The hallways were lined with photographs of military ceremonies and portraits of distinguished officers, reminding Jake once again of the deep history and tradition he had so carelessly dismissed. They were shown into a simple meeting room with a few chairs and a table. Colonel Whitfield took a seat near the window, while Sarah sat close to Jake, her hand finding his in a gesture of support, despite everything that had happened. "Corporal Davies will be here shortly," Constable Thompson explained. "He's agreed to this meeting on his own time, which I want you to remember. This is not part of his official duties." Jake nodded, his palms sweating as he rehearsed what he wanted to say. Every version of his apology sounded inadequate in his head, but he knew he had to try. When the door opened and Corporal Davies entered in his red dress uniform, Jake was struck again by the man's commanding presence. Out of his ceremonial position, the guard looked younger than Jake had expected, probably only a few years older than himself. But there was a maturity and seriousness in his bearing that made Jake feel like a child in comparison. "Corporal Davies," Colonel Whitfield said, rising to greet the younger man. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I believe Mr. Thompson here has something he'd like to say to you." Jake stood up awkwardly, his legs feeling unsteady. Face to face with the soldier he had tried to humiliate, all his prepared words seemed to evaporate. For a moment the room was silent except for the sound of his own rapid breathing. "I'm sorry," Jake finally managed, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm so incredibly sorry for what I did today. I had no idea. I mean, I knew you were a soldier, but I didn't understand what that meant.
I didn't know about your service in Afghanistan.
Or how hard you worked to earn your position." Corporal Davies listened without expression, his hands clasped behind his back in a military posture that Jake was beginning to recognize as natural rather than performative. "I treated you like you were some kind of theme park attraction," Jake continued, the words coming faster now, "like you were there for my entertainment. I was so focused on getting a viral video that I forgot you were a real person doing an important job." The soldier's expression remained neutral, but Jake thought he detected a slight softening around his eyes. "I know my apology can't undo the disrespect I showed you in your uniform and everything it represents," Jake pressed on. "But I want you to know that I've learned something today. About respect, about service, about what it means to be a soldier, and I'm going to make sure other people learn from my mistake too." For a long moment, Corporal Davies said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and Jake began to worry that his apology had fallen flat. But then the soldier spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "Thank you for the apology," he said simply. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, especially in front of other people." Jake felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the soldier wasn't finished. "What happened today wasn't really about me," Corporal Davies continued. "It was about what this uniform represents. The history, the sacrifice, the commitment to something bigger than yourself. When you disrespected the uniform, you disrespected everyone who's ever worn it." Jake nodded, understanding flooding through him. "I see that now. And I want to do something to make it right." "The best way to make it right," the soldier said, "is to make sure it doesn't happen again. Not just you, but other people who might not understand what they're looking at when they see a Queen's Guard." As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, Jake realized that this encounter had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The quest for viral fame that had driven him to Buckingham Palace that morning seemed like a relic from someone else's life. 3 weeks after returning from London, Jake sat in his small apartment in Phoenix staring at his laptop screen. The video he had been working on for the past 5 days was finally ready, but he hesitated before clicking the upload button. This wasn't like his usual content. There were no flashy graphics, no upbeat music, no attempts at humor. It was just him, speaking directly to the camera about the hardest lesson he had ever learned. His original video from Buckingham Palace had now been viewed over 2 million times across various platforms. It had been featured on news programs, shared in military veteran groups, and had become a textbook example of tourist behavior gone wrong. The comments section had become a battleground between people defending his right to have fun and others explaining why his actions were so problematic. Jake had lost his job, just as he had feared. His boss had called him into the office the day after he returned and explained that the company couldn't be associated with someone who had become synonymous with disrespectful behavior. The video had been shared by several of their clients, and the negative publicity was affecting business relationships. But in a strange way, losing his job had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself. For years, he had been chasing external validation through social media likes and shares, never stopping to consider whether his actions might hurt other people. The encounter with Corporal Davies and Colonel Whitfield had shattered that shallow worldview completely. Sarah had stayed with him through the worst of it, though their relationship had been strained by the experience. She had been accepted into a graduate program in London and would be moving there in 2 months. They had talked honestly about whether they had a future together, and both agreed that Jake needed to focus on becoming the kind of person who deserved her respect. "Are you ready to post it?" Sarah asked, sitting beside him on the couch. She had helped him write the script for the video, pushing him to be more honest and direct than he was naturally comfortable being. "I think so," Jake replied, though his fingers still hovered over the mouse. "It's just, once this goes live, there's no taking it back. Everyone's going to see how badly I screwed up." "They already know how badly you screwed up," Sarah said gently. "This is your chance to show them what you've learned from it." Jake took a deep breath and clicked upload. The video was titled "I Was Wrong, a Real Apology to the Queen's Guard and Everyone I Hurt." In it, he spoke for nearly 20 minutes about his experience in London, his conversation with Colonel Whitfield, his meeting with Corporal Davies, and the research he had done afterward about military service and the history of the Queen's Guard. He had spent hours reading about the regiment's history, watching documentaries about British military traditions, and even reaching out to veterans' organizations to better understand the significance of what he had interfered with that day. The video included historical footage and photographs that helped explain why the Queen's Guard ceremony was so much more than a tourist attraction. But the most important part of the video was Jake's direct address to other young people who might be tempted to treat military, personnel, or cultural traditions as props for social media content. He spoke about the difference between harmless fun and genuine disrespect, about the importance of understanding context and history before acting, and about the real human beings behind the uniforms and ceremonies that tourists encounter around the world. Within hours of posting, the video began to gain traction. Unlike his original viral moment, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Veterans groups shared it with approval, educators used it as a teaching tool, and other social media influencers praised Jake for taking responsibility for his actions. One comment that particularly moved him came from someone claiming to be a member of the Grenadier Guards. "This is what real accountability looks like. Thank you for learning from your mistake and helping others avoid making the same one." But the comment that meant the most came 3 days after posting, from an account with the simple username W. Davies. "Well said, mate. Respect earned." Jake stared at the comment for a long time, wondering if it could really be from Corporal Davies himself. Whether it was or not, it represented something important: the possibility of redemption through genuine growth and understanding. The video eventually garnered over 5 million views, far exceeding the reach of his original mistake. News outlets that had covered his embarrassing encounter with the Royal Guard now reported on his thoughtful response and genuine efforts to make amends. Several organizations invited him to speak about digital citizenship and respectful behavior, opportunities that he approached with the same seriousness he had learned from his experience in London. Jake never did return to his old job, but he discovered something more meaningful in the work he began doing with educational programs and cultural sensitivity training. His viral moment of stupidity had become the foundation for a purpose he never could have imagined: helping others understand the importance of respect, dignity, and thinking before acting. 6 months after the incident, he received an unexpected package in the mail. Inside was a small pin in the shape of the Grenadier Guards insignia, along with a note written in precise handwriting. "For demonstrating that growth and honor can come from acknowledging our mistakes. From all of us who stand guard." Jake pinned it to his jacket and wore it everywhere, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of the day he learned that true strength comes not from getting attention, but from earning respect. His 15 minutes of fame had cost him dearly, but it had given him something infinitely more valuable: the understanding of what it meant to be a decent human being. Sarah, preparing for her move to London, watched her boyfriend's transformation with amazement. The cocky, attention-seeking young man she had dated was gone, replaced by someone thoughtful and purpose-driven. They both knew their romantic relationship wouldn't survive the distance, but they parted as friends, proud of the growth that had emerged from such an embarrassing beginning. And sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep, Jake would think about Corporal Davies standing perfectly still in his red tunic and bearskin hat, dedicated to a duty that connected him to centuries of tradition and service. He would remember the moment when their eyes met during the changing of the guard ceremony, and he would feel grateful that his moment of stupidity had led him to understand what real honor looked like.